All right. So my parents are here all the way from California, so I sure hope I don't mess this up. So this morning I want to talk a little bit about a guy named Daniel. You know, we're in the Stranger Things series, and we're talking about some of the weird things in the Bible and the way that those weird things in the Bible can strengthen our faith. You know, back in 1975, a baby was born in Vietnam. Now, most of you know that that was a war-torn country at the time, and so this baby really had no shot at life. As a matter of fact, the parents couldn't take care of this child, so they left baby Kelly lying in a ditch on the side of the road in Vietnam. But as this baby lay there crying and obviously unable to take care of itself, a stranger walked down the road and heard this baby cry and picked it up and decided that he was going to save the baby, took it into a local village, and the local village didn't really want anything to do with her. But they did anyway, and then part of this is called Operation Baby Life. It was an adoption program back in the 70s. They came to this village and they found this baby that well, she was a toddler at the time, was barely really scraping by, and they thought, you know what, this child would be a great candidate for Operation Baby Life. So far, she's survived a ditch, she's survived a village that didn't want her, and now she's getting on this airplane to fly to the United States to have a better life. But unfortunately, on her way to the United States, the plane went down. And it crashed and it killed 150 people on board. But not baby Kelly. Kelly survived the plane crash. And as she got to the United States, she was adopted by a wonderful family in Seattle. But when she was 10 years old, she was diagnosed with leukemia. And she didn't think she had much time left. But this young child had a fighting spirit. She fought her way through it. She ended up becoming a very successful businesswoman as an adult. Pretty amazing that one life can face death so many times, right? Left in a ditch, living in a village, plane crash, leukemia, and still ending up being successful. Well, that's one of the amazing things about God is we can face death just as many times, but our salvation is eternal, isn't it? So it's amazing that we get to face that same type of joy where we cannot be defeated. And we get to see this a lot in the life of Daniel because Daniel ends up being, his life gets threatened all the time also. And we're going to talk about him this morning. Actually, we're going to talk about three people. We're going to talk about Daniel, who was from the nation of Judah. And then we're going to talk about two kings of Babylon. We're going to talk about Nebuchadnezzar, and we're going to talk about Belshazzar, or Belshazzar. So, this morning I want to give you just a little bit of a background to Daniel. He was taken out of his home country as a teenager to go live in Babylon. Now, what had happened back then was the Jews weren't getting along very well with the Babylonians because they weren't paying what they were supposed to pay, the honors to them. So what happened was they took all of these wealthy, prominent people from the nation of Judah and drug them off to Babylon it was kind of a cultural explosion there. They had all these wealthy people from different nations where they could really boost their culture in Babylon. Now, I'm going to take a look at Daniel starting in chapter 1, verse 3, to get kind of a background on Daniel. It says, Then the king, I'm not used to doing that. There we go. Then the king commanded Ashpenaz, his chief eunuch, to bring some of the people of Israel, both of the royal family and of the nobility, youths without blemish, of good appearance, and skillful in all wisdom, endowed with knowledge, understanding, and learning, and competent to stand in the king's palace, and to teach them the literature and language of the Chaldeans. See, Nebuchadnezzar selected the best Jews to keep around, but they had requirements, okay? First of all, you had to be attractive. No ugly people working for the king. Obviously, we don't have that rule at this church because I'm not going to finish that sentence. I would never say that in public. So you had to be attractive. You had to be wise, okay? Good decision maker, okay? You had to be smart. No dumb people working for the king. And you had to be competent. Not someone who was too shy, not someone who was afraid to try new things. So you really had to be a good quality person. Now Daniel and his buddies, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, made the cut. Now if you don't know who Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah are, that's because you probably know them by their Babylonian names, which are Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. It's not Abednego, by the way. That always bothers me. I don't know why. It's Abednego. But when you put it together, it sounds like Abednego. So anyway, see, the point is that God honors those who keep him first. Let's look at Daniel chapter 1, verse 19. It says, And the king spoke with them, and among all of them none was found like Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. Therefore they stood before the king. And in every matter of wisdom and understanding about which the king inquired of them, he found them 10 times better than all the magicians and enchanters that were in the kingdom. Here is why Daniel is so important, because he is the best of God's best. All right, he was a good, solid guy all the way around, through and through. Now, if we fast forward a little bit, King Nebuchadnezzar had some disturbing dreams and he really couldn't sleep. So he tells all these wise men to come around and he gives them this impossible challenge. He says, hey guys, I'm having some crazy dreams. Tell me what they are, tell me what they mean, or I'm going to kill you. Okay? Not a seat we all want to sit in, right? It's easy to okay, tell me what your dream is. Okay, and then you can make up an interpretation. That's easy. But to actually say what the dream is without him telling you is really difficult to do. So that's what they had to do. So basically everybody was just going to die because nobody can do that. So so Daniel says this, okay, in chapter 2, verse 27. He says, Daniel answered the king and said, no wise men, enchanters, magicians, or astrologers can show to the king the mystery that the king has asked, but there is a God in heaven who reveals mysteries, and he has made known to King Nebuchadnezzar what will be in the latter days. Okay, so Daniel says, look, I can't tell you what the dream is, but there's a God who can. So he goes and he inquires of God. He figures out what the dream is, and he tells Nebuchadnezzar what his dream is and what it means. Now later, Daniel has a similar vision, and these are the two things put together. So the one on the right is Daniel's vision. Is that the right? I'm sorry, the one on the left is Daniel's vision, and the one on the right is Nebuchadnezzar's dream. The one on the right is a statue made up of all these different materials on the way up. And the ones on the left are these 4 strange creatures. Now, what they all represent is they represent these different kingdoms or empires that are going to come along. So the first one is going to be Nebuchadnezzar's kingdom. So that's represented by that lion with wings there, and on the statue it's represented by the golden head. So what that is gold is a valuable thing, right? It's not the strongest, but it is very valuable. And now lions with eagle's wings, both a lion and an eagle are both kings of their domain, right? Eagles are kind of kings of the sky, and lions are kings of the jungle. So they're very powerful, very prominent, and valuable is what this first kingdom is going to be. But they're going to be reduced as the wings are plucked off later, and then is going to come a second kingdom, which is called Medo-Persia. Now this is a group of 2 groups, the Medes and the Persians, that come together, and it's led by Cyrus and Darius. Now that's going to be the arms and the chest on the statue, so that's made out of silver, which is valuable, not quite as much as gold, but still valuable. And then the animal is going to be a bear there with these ribs hanging out of his mouth. All right, so most of us in the South know what it looks like when somebody's sitting around with ribs hanging out of their mouth, right? It says he's going to devour much flesh, but the bear is tilted, he's crooked. One leg is longer than the other. Now that's because between the Medes and the Persians, one kingdom or one group of people is stronger than the other, so the bear is tilted to represent that one is stronger than the other. Now that's going to be the Medo-Persians, and then is going to come the loin area here, which is a belly and thighs of bronze. Now bronze is really strong, right? And this is going to represent the empire of Greece, led by Alexander the Great. And then the animal is going to be this leopard with 4 wings and 4 heads, and the 4 heads represent his 4 generals. And then the last one there is going to be Rome, this crazy monster at the bottom that just has all these horns and it's weird looking. And then the legs of iron, that's going to represent Rome. And then there's the toes, which are mixed of iron and clay, and that's going to be a future kingdom that you learn about later on. But, so the 2 that we're going to focus on today is this transition at the top, okay, going from Babylon to the Medo-Persians. That's what you need to remember. So with all those 4 kingdoms, if you can remember any of them, just remember the first 2. The Persians and the Medes are going to take over from Babylon. Okay, so basically after Daniel tells Nebuchadnezzar about his dream, of course Nebuchadnezzar is impressed by this, right? It's like, wow, this guy actually told me my dream. So he bows down and he actually honors God. So check this out in chapter 2, verse 47 says, the king answered and said to Daniel, truly your God is God of gods and Lord of kings, and a revealer of mysteries, for you have been able to reveal this mystery. Then the king gave Daniel high honors and many great gifts, and made him ruler over the whole province of Babylon and chief prefect over all the wise men of Babylon. See, God's purpose was fulfilled right there. God ended up being honored in Babylon because of this awesome thing that it wasn't really Daniel doing. Remember, he said, hey, there's a God in heaven that can do this. So God ends up being honored in Babylon because of this. And now, later on, Nebuchadnezzar has this second dream. Okay, now Nebuchadnezzar's second dream begins a story of comparison between him and his grandson. We have Nebuchadnezzar and Belshazzar. Now, Nebuchadnezzar has a dream, and in this dream, there's this big, beautiful tree which represents him, and it provides for all of his land, but then the tree gets chopped down. And of course, this dream makes him a little nervous, so he asks Daniel again, so what does this dream mean? And he says, well, here's what's going to happen. He ends up getting this. It's called lycanthropy. Lycanthropy is when you become convinced that you are an animal. Specifically, if you get boanthropy, it's when you're convinced that you are an ox. So basically, he gets these long dreadlocks and these long fingernails, and in the 90s he could have played bass in a grunge band or something. But for a king, it's not a real good look, right? Obviously, you don't look at that and think, oh, that's a good king right there. It looks like a monster. So he lives outside and he eats grass, and he does it for 7 years. Why would God want this king to look like that and act like that for 7 years? It's to humble him, to show him, Nebuchadnezzar, you are simply a king because I put you there. There is nothing about you that is great. And after 7 years, he kind of figures it out. And he ends up fixing himself, and he honors God. So let's look at Daniel chapter 4, verse 37. And this is Nebuchadnezzar's words in the book of Daniel. He says, now I, Nebuchadnezzar, praise and extol and honor the King of heaven, for all his works are right and his ways are just. And those who walk in pride, he is able to humble. Believe me, he knows that God will humble you because of the way that he looked. See, here's the thing. Without God, we're all just beasts. There's nothing good about us if we don't have God in our lives. We are capable of all sorts of horrible things, rape and murder and all sorts of sin that we are able to commit if we don't have God. But the cool thing is that no matter how bad we get, God can always restore us. No matter what we've done, God can restore us, even if we look like Nebuchadnezzar. But here's the thing. So that was Nebuchadnezzar's challenge. He was humbled, and after 7 years, he gave honor to God, and he was restored. But now his grandson is going to come on the scene, and this doesn't work out too good for him. Now, there's a problem, and I'm just going to go over this quickly. Nebuchadnezzar is the second king there of Babylon in this dynasty. Now, his son, Evil Merodach, obviously he's not a good guy if your first name is Evil, right? Evil Merodach is the son, but he ends up getting killed because nobody really likes him. So he goes to the next heir, which is the husband of his daughter, which is Nergal-Sar-Ezer. Now, he dies of natural causes, but then his son comes on the scene, which is that Laboros-Shoashad, or however you say that, but that sounds pretty good. Laboros-Shoashad was actually a kid. He was probably about 10 years old while he was the king, and he was very bratty, he was very angry, and he was probably deteriorated mentally. He had some mental capacity problems. So this band got together and beat him to death, and then this guy, Nabonidus, who was married to Nebuchadnezzar's other daughter, takes over. So Nabonidus, for years and years and years, archaeologists believe Nabonidus was the last king of Babylon because that's what the archaeological evidence said. He is the last king. So everybody looked at the Bible and said, well, the Bible's clearly wrong because they say that the last king was Belshazzar. But archaeology says that it was Nabonidus. Well, here's what they found out in the 1800s. See that little cylinder there at the bottom? That cylinder is called the Nabonidus cylinder. And what's on there was actually, it says, King Nabonidus and his son Belshazzar. They found out that the Bible had been right all along. And that's one of the cool things about the Bible, is anytime you read something that you doubt, we're probably only a few hundred years, a decade away from finding the evidence that's going to say, oh, the Bible's actually been right the whole time. So we found out that actually Belshazzar was really Nabonidus' grandson. I just thought that was cool, so I wanted to share that. Okay, so the last king here is Nabonidus, but his son, Belshazzar, wasn't actually a king. He was what's called a co-regent. So he was basically sharing the kingdomship with his dad. But see, here's the thing, is his dad wasn't really a good guy. His dad came in, and everybody in Babylon liked this god. It was the calf god of the sun called Marduk. But he liked this other god, the moon god, called Sin. Interesting that it's called Sin, right? So he leaves and he starts setting up all these temples, and he leaves his son in charge. Let me tell you something. You never leave your son in charge if you want to go get something done. I heard this story. I'm not allowed to say who it is, but it's one of my wife's sisters. She has 4 of them, so you don't know the name. But when she was 18, she had a habit of driving up to the mountains near our house in California. And she was, 18, so she would drive, and she would take her boyfriend with her, and they'd go through these windy curves around the edge of the mountain and kind of look over the coast of California. And one day, her dad needed to go get her a car, so he flew with my wife, so she wasn't there, so you can't get her in trouble. She was in Texas with her dad, and back home, Tasha's sister was waiting for her dad to bring her a car. So because she didn't have a car, she had to borrow one from her aunt. So she's driving her aunt's car. Well, an 18-year-old being an 18-year-old, her boyfriend came over and, of course, stole her car, or her aunt's car, and decided he was going to do what they like to do. He went up driving in the mountains. But he wasn't quite an experienced driver, so when he came around a corner, he missed it, went over the edge of a cliff, and crashed right into a tree. Crashed into a tree. They ended up having to walk all the way down the mountain. They got chased by coyotes, and it's a great story. But in the end, he gets down, and later, Tasha's sister has no idea where her aunt's car is, and her dad gets home. Well, eventually she found out that her boyfriend stole her car and wrecked it, and it took them days to find the car. They had no idea where it was. But basically his reaction was, I left you in charge for 5 days, and you ended up putting your aunt's car into a tree? What's wrong with you? Well, that's what's going to happen with Nabonidus. He's going to come back, and he's going to be like, I left you in charge, and you lost the entire kingdom in 1 day? What's wrong with you? So you never leave a teenager in charge when you're gone. Just remember that. Okay, so here's how it happens. So basically, Belshazzar, he's at this, in charge of the kingdom. He's in Babylon. He's having a good time. He's getting drunk with his buddies and his wives and his concubines. And he decides that he's just going to keep enjoying, and he's going to desecrate God's temple. Because when they had invaded Jerusalem, they took all of these gold vessels, these beautiful golden vessels used for sacrifice and ceremonial washing and things like that. They took them from Jerusalem, brought them to Babylon, and he decided, I got a great idea, guys, because this is what drunken people do at parties. Let's start drinking out of these holy vessels from the God of Jerusalem. And they're like, yeah, let's do it. So they do it. And guess who doesn't like that very much? God. Here's what happens here in chapter 5. Belshazzar, when he tasted the wine, commanded that the vessels of gold and silver that Nebuchadnezzar his father had taken out of the temple in Jerusalem be brought, that the king and his lords, his wives and his concubines might drink from them. Then they brought in the golden vessels that had been taken out of the temple, the house of God in Jerusalem. And the king and his lords and his wives and concubines drank from them. They drank wine and praised the gods of gold and silver, bronze, iron, wood, and stone. He's in trouble now. So many people say, well, Pastor Dan, drinking's not really a sin. Well, that might be true. I mean, Christ did use wine to illustrate his blood, but I'll tell you what. A lot of dumb things happen when a bunch of people get together and drink too much. Can I at least get some agreement on that one? Okay. So here's a great example of that. Hey guys, let's get God's vessels and let's drink from them and see what happens. General Stonewall Jackson said this, I am more afraid of alcohol than of all the bullets of the enemy, because alcohol can do some real damage. Now, this isn't a sermon that's anti-alcohol, but it is a sermon about anti-dumb. I'm glad that one settled in. Now, the crazy thing is, while this wild party is going on, just outside the gates are probably the empire of the Medo-Persians ready to march in and take the city. They're probably sitting outside right at this very moment. And then he turns around and he sees Thing from the Addams Family. Am I that old? Has anybody ever seen the Addams Family? Remember Thing, the little hand that walks around? All right, whatever. I thought it was funny. Okay. It says this, Daniel 5:5. Immediately the fingers of a human hand appeared and wrote on the plaster of the wall of the king's palace opposite the lampstand. And the king saw the hand as it wrote. Okay? So think about this. He's sitting there, and Thing shows up and starts graffitiing the king's wall. That had to be the most terrifying sight ever seen. Can you imagine for a second? I was actually going to ask somebody to poke their hand out between the curtains right now, but I don't want to give any heart attacks. But see, here's the thing. He was terrified. Let's take a look at Daniel 5:6. It says that the king's color changed. The king's color. Some of you guys, I've heard some stories about a gorilla suit that's made some people's colors change. And I see some of you have heard that story too. Here's the thing. He was scared to death. The king's color changed and his thoughts alarmed him. His limbs gave way and his knees knocked together. That's scared right there. If your knees are going to knock together, you're pretty scared. I'll tell you, that happened to me twice in my life. My limbs have knocked together because I was scared. The first one was my hand got caught in a piece of machinery at work, and I thought I was going to lose my hand. That was one. The second one, if you're in youth, you already know this story. I was flying an airplane one time. I was working on getting my pilot's license. This was my first cross-country flight. And what you have to do on your first cross-country is you have to go a certain distance, and you have to land at 3 airports. Well, I'd already flown all the way to Palm Springs. You might not know where that is. And I was on my way back to land at an airport in a city called Rialto. Now, where Rialto is, it's surrounded at the top, or on the east side, by mountains, and then the ocean on this side. Okay, so you have cold air from the ocean. On the other side of the mountains is the desert. So you have all this wind that wants to get over these mountains, and there's a gap in there called the Cajon Pass, and the wind just rushes through there, right through Rialto. My parents live there, and they have to go pick their garbage cans up from the end of the street every week. So, I mean, it's just crazy windy there all the time. So, and for whatever reason, my instructor said, hey, your first time flying by yourself, you should land at this airport. So I'm coming into land, and I'm getting ready to land on the big runway, and this guy comes on the radio and says, hey, you might want to try runway 30, which is a much smaller runway, but it's directly into the wind. And I thought, whatever. Let me give this a shot. So I start to land, and the wind was blowing so hard that I swear you could get outside of the airplane and walk alongside me as I'm flying into the wind, because I was just sitting there and hovering down because the wind was so strong in my face. So I land, and I stop immediately because my plane wasn't really moving, and I go and I take off, and I'm like, this is awesome. I'm doing great. All I have to do is go home, and I'm done. And then that wind started hitting me, and the turbulence started shaking my plane. And I started thinking, man, this plane's awful small. And suddenly I got hit with this huge air pocket. And I dropped 500 feet, and all of a sudden, the next thing I know is I'm looking down on the airplane because it dropped so fast. I hit my head on the ceiling, and I looked down on my airplane, and then it knocked my glasses off, so everything went white. It knocked my headset off, so all I heard was, beep, and I'm thinking, I just died. Out-of-body experience, looking down on the airplane, everything's over. But then I start to kind of come to, and I realize, okay, I think everything's fine. And I start looking, I'm thinking, did my wings fall off? Like, what just happened? And then I realized that can happen again at any moment. And my knees just started shaking the whole rest of the flight home. By the time I made it home and landed, I got it, I threw the keys to my instructor and said, I'm never getting in an airplane again. And that was it. Thank God it wasn't, because I did get my pilot's license. But let me tell you, that was the scariest thing I ever went through. And I can't imagine what it would be like right now to turn and look at the wall and see a hand appear and start writing me a note in a language that I don't understand. I wouldn't want to know what that note had to say. So the king, he ends up calling Daniel in because his wife says, look, chill out, dude. There's this guy that already knows how to translate things like this. Call Daniel and he'll tell you. So Daniel walks in, and Daniel has to give the king some bad news. And what he does is he says this. Daniel 5:22. And you, his son, Belshazzar, have... Oh, excuse me, I need to tell you this before I get there. He reminds Belshazzar first that Nebuchadnezzar turned his life around. He says, Nebuchadnezzar, before I tell you what that says, or Belshazzar, before I tell you what that says, you need to know that your grandpa turned his life around. And here's what he says about you. He says, and you, his son, that's actually not son, it's actually his grandson, because Hebrew doesn't really have a word for grandfather. But it says, and you, his son, Belshazzar, have not humbled your heart, though you knew all this. But you have lifted up yourself against the Lord of heaven, and the vessels of his house have been brought in before you, and you and your lords, your wives, and your concubines have drunk wine from them, and you have praised the gods of silver and gold, of bronze, iron, wood, and stone, which do not see or hear or know, but the God in whose hand is your breath, of whose all your ways you have not honored. In other words, you are in deep doo-doo. And he explains that the hand wrote this. It's Mene, Mene, Tekel, and Parson. Now, Johnny Cash sings a song about this. Have any of you ever heard of a guy named Johnny Cash? Sings a song, my friend, you're weighed in the balance and found wanting. And I'm the only one who knows this song. Okay. What that means is you are weighed in the balance. God has numbered the days of your kingdom and brought it to an end. You have been weighed in the balances and found wanting. So basically there's a scale, right? And God takes his righteousness and puts it on one side of the scale. And he says, okay, now here's where Belshazzar is. You want more. You need to be better if you're going to balance this out. Okay? He says, you've been weighed in the balances and found wanting. Your kingdom is divided and given to the Medes and the Persians. This is your last night, is what he's saying. Now, that must have been really awkward for Daniel at that moment, saying, hey, you're going to lose your kingdom tonight. And then they're like, all right, so I guess we just sit here and wait for that? And Daniel's like, I really hope this happens because it'd be awkward if it doesn't. So Daniel 5:30 says, that very night Belshazzar, the Chaldean king, was killed, and Darius the Mede received the kingdom, being about 62 years old. So the whole time, he's probably sitting outside, ready to come in and take over the city. And it was probably very easy to do. Remember I told you that King Nabonidus was off building these temples to the moon god Sin, but the city didn't like it because they liked the solar calf god Marduk? Well, when Darius the Mede came in, he said, hey guys, tell you what, we're going to reinstate the worship of Marduk. So everyone was like, yeah, come on in, Darius. We don't need to be Babylonian. We can be Medo-Persian. So he comes in, he takes over, he instantly institutes the rights of Marduk. And that's it for Belshazzar and Babylon. Now there's a couple of things that we can take from this story. First of all, we need to understand that God preserves the faithful. And we can learn that not only because Psalms tells us that, but because we can see that Daniel's life and safety were threatened time and time and time and time again. Every time Daniel was put to the test, the result if he failed was, you're going to be killed. Right? Daniel in the lion's den, trying to interpret the dreams. Remember, there was a point where he was not eating the king's food. He kept doing these things to honor God, and the whole time the result was always going to be, you're going to die. But every time he didn't, because he honored God and God preserved him. Now, I can't promise you what your preservation is going to look like, but I can promise you that if you are faithful to God, he will preserve you. Worst case scenario, they kill you, and you get to spend eternity with God. You win. So you will be preserved. There's a saying, it says, remember, God has something up his sleeve besides his everlasting arm. God already has a plan for whatever it is that you're going through. See, when Napoleon was attacking Austria, he was coming over the mountains at a certain point, and he was going to take over this little town. When he got over the mountains, the Austrians already knew that they were going to lose to Napoleon, so they got together and they started talking, and they said, well, tomorrow's Sunday, what should we do? Should we have church like normal, or should we run and hide? And they all got together and they agreed, if they take us, they take us, but tomorrow's Sunday, we're going to honor God. So they did. That next morning, even though Napoleon's army was coming over the mountains, they walked into church and they started ringing the church bells with joy because they still have reason to find hope in their Savior. Well, as Napoleon came over, he heard the church bells, and they actually thought it was the Austrian army coming over the hill after them, and they turned around and fled. God preserved them because they were honoring God. So I sure hope that if some army ever starts invading, that we all come right here, and that you all have your concealed carry stuff that we need to. The next thing we can learn is that we should not water down God's word. Now, more specifically, I should say that we should not water down God's message. This goes beyond just what the Bible says. See, Daniel had to give plenty of kings bad news, right? Hey, Nebuchadnezzar, you're going to turn into a 90s rocker. Hey, Belshazzar, you're going to die tonight, and your dad's going to be pretty mad. See, even though that was the consequence, he still spoke honestly all the time. And we still have a message to deliver today as well, don't we? Don't we have a message that we're supposed to share with the world around us? See, and thankfully, God sent a Savior for all of us sinners, and that's who we're supposed to be sharing with, right? But see, we have pressure to kind of let sin go. As we begin to be more accepting of things like divorce and homosexuality and evolution and all these things, we accept what the world tells us, but we're scared to turn around and tell the world what the Bible tells us. So we have to be like Daniel and speak honestly about our faith. And then finally, we can trust that God's going to follow through. See, this is the big one, because God has made us promises, and He's going to keep them, church. And if you believe that, it will change your life. Now, I'd like to invite the worship team to come up, and we're going to get back into worship here real quick. And as they're on their way up, I just want to share that, if you take a look at God and what He's done, that He loves you enough to send His own Son to die on a cross for you. The truth is that when it comes to God, armies cannot defeat Him. Schools cannot explain Him. Leaders cannot ignore Him. Rome could not kill Him. Pharisees could not confuse Him. Hitler could not exterminate His people. The New Age cannot replace Him. And Oprah cannot find 10 easier steps to save your soul. That's because God is light, He is love, He is longevity, and most importantly, He is our Lord. When I face loss, He provides for me. When I face death, He carries me home. He is everything, everywhere, for everyone, every time, and in every way, because He is God, and if He said it, well, that settles it. If you're on His side, you have nothing to worry about. But here's the thing. Please, please, please don't be a Belshazzar. It's not worth losing the kingdom.